So Kelly's been the one that's come in. This was Sarah, the middle one, and so this was classic Sarah. So we're out doing a round here at Digital Wildcatters. One of the VC funds had kind of thrown out, hey, we want to cut a bigger check than you need. Would Chuck sell some of his shares? And we're potentially talking a 10x uplift on this. And so Colin was asking me that, and hey, what do you think? I said, let me go ask Sarah. So talking to Sarah last night, who is a freshman at Vanderbilt, right? And as I've said many times, she'll run the world one day. I don't know if for good or for evil, but she will run it. So I call Sarah. I'm like, hey, Sarah, we got a chance to sell some of our Digital Wildcatter share. It might be, I don't know, 8 or 10x up. What do you think we should do? She goes, yes, Daddy, sell them. And please don't go buy a plane with that money. All right. So 1 week out, the election.
1 week out.
Yeah. Ramp Capital tweeted out, the best thing about this election is it's almost over. And I tweeted back, pretty optimistic, aren't you? So, all right. So
yeah, I think there's been some states that have said it's going to be days, couple of weeks. Yeah.
Which is just,
it's been a circus and it's only getting more surreal.
Remember all of the negative stuff around Bush and Gore and how nobody could count in one day, and it feels like we've only gone backwards. It's
right.
Now par for the course.
With more technology.
With more technology, exactly. All right, so I sent out an article or a tweet, and I have not read the article because I don't subscribe to Bloomberg, given that I'm a man of modest means, living on a limited pension, but basically, I think the tweet laid it all out. Supposedly, environmental activists are drafting blueprints. So let's call this Environmental 2025 for the Harris administration when she takes office. And the blueprint talks about using executive power, limit LNG, shutting down Energy Transfer's LP Dakota Access Pipeline, push for a swift end to oil and gas production using special emergency authority to bar crude exports, curb U.S. public investment in foreign fossil fuel projects, and a federal investigation of the oil and gas industry's approach to climate crisis. Mark, what do you think about this? The reason I'm troubled by this, and I'm probably stating the obvious, and I'll try to do it with an air of discovery, is just we don't know. You read this and you go, is she for this or against this? I know she said, no, she will not ban fracking, but we all know you don't ban fracking, right? You go to the EPA and you twist what
you disincentivize it.
Yeah, you twist levers here and there so that it's economically impractical. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think, what's doable from an executive action standpoint or an executive order standpoint is the primary concern, because we saw quite a bit of rollback in 2021, in January of 21, when President Biden took office. I forget how many executive orders were immediate rollbacks of some things that either related to immigration or other things that the Trump administration had put in place. I think the administrative agency aspect of this and the linkage to executive action is probably primary concern. But I also think legislatively, one, what does Congress look like after the election? And two, consider the fact that she did cast the deciding vote for a watershed piece of arguably climate legislation, Inflation Reduction Act. And so I think from a principle standpoint, forget who said it. I think it was Bernie Sanders said, her softened stance on a lot of these lightning rod issues, particularly related to climate and energy, as her campaign was getting underway, was consistent with what he believed politically was the right thing to do. So say what you got to say to get elected.
Yeah, and this goes back to something that just has really bothered me. You know, as much as we hate our two-party system and we hate the primaries and like, they serve a role. They vet. You have to go to the most extremist part of your party and tell them what you're willing to live with and what you're not willing to live with, and whether you're going to honor that or not. That's facts for the jury, right? The voting public gets to decide whether they believe you or not. But at least these type things get vetted through. We literally have somebody running for president in 2019 that said they would ban fracking, who now says they won't ban fracking. There's been no story of, man, I saw the power of American natural gas as I served in an executive role. We didn't have that in California. I didn't appreciate it. No story on potentially why you changed your mind, just simply that you did. And it's disconcerting because this is really important. I mean, this is global scale geopolitical. Lives depend on the United States having access to energy.
Right. And these are the things that I think are within our either sphere of expertise or limited influence in terms of things that we would advise people to really think through before they go vote next Tuesday. And assuming you didn't vote early, it goes back to, I think the hard push from the legislation defined as the IRA, and we're starting to see, some early speed bumps defined as, the rollout of the charging stations, or Ford continuing to lose money in its EV division. A lot of auto manufacturers, either shifting new capital expenditures pretty far out to the right with indefinite, timelines related to that transition. But, another hard push here up against a set of realities that, I think we've pushed as much as we've been able to push, either from an affordability standpoint or from sheer physics and feasibility. So is this the time to double down or triple down on that if you've got the power to do so, either through executive action or through a coalition in Congress that then puts more legislative layers on top of executive orders and administrative agency action? Well, I do know one thing: if that does reaccelerate, it's going to cost a lot more.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear here, because I am not waving the banner for either side on this. I'm happy to share with people what I think and what I would do. But my big concern here is we're not having a thoughtful, honest discussion about this and the true ramifications. I mean, to your point that you just said, if we really are going to electrify our transportation fleet, that's a lot of money. And we really need to do a thorough analysis on payback, if you will, in terms of carbon footprint on that. How much are we truly saving in the way of CO2 emissions? Because you've heard me talk about this numerous times, but I believe it's Volvo. You can go, one of the car manufacturers did a study. It's a couple years dated now, but they did a study on exactly the payback in terms of carbon footprint. And you can go read it. It's 145 pages. I've flipped through a lot of it. But basically, they're talking, call it 5-year paybacks on an electric vehicle being less carbon intensive than an internal combustion engine.
So net zero.
Yeah, exactly.
As a consumer or as an emitter of scope 3 from an ICE vehicle,
you
zero that out over 5+ years.
Exactly, because I mean the manufacturing process, and it comes down to how you're charging the vehicle, and even in Europe, where they have way more in the way of renewables than we do here, I think it was still a 4-year payback, et cetera. So I just hate that we're not being thoughtful in discussing this because, look, I get it. Somebody may die from global warming in 100 years, but I do know that more expensive energy costs today, less access to transportation, and the economic benefits that affords in America today cost lives today, too.
Well, as you've said, without energy or high energy, unaffordably high energy prices, people do die.
Yeah.
And not to be too extreme, I just think the whole set of Planck issues on energy and climate, at least to me, my read of it is they've been pushed way down kind of the rhetoric priority, because I don't think, either side is as equipped to deal with the facts and the data. You saw, I think it was Hurricane Milton, you saw Ron DeSantis come out and cite off things like Chris Mart's facts about where Milton ranked in the history of landfalling major hurricanes in Florida over the entire history, provided the stats about frequency and intensity. And so having that kind of fact-based discussion in public has been largely missing from both sides, I think. I did listen to the almost 3 hours of Trump on Rogan. And really what you heard is, and I think it's an official policy promise or campaign promise, that by January of 2026, your energy prices are going to be cut in half.
Right.
Well, how does that happen? If, we continue to have the types of friction in things like electric power generation and what just is really the organic effect of, for example, adding a bunch of new generation and capital to the grids like we have in ERCOT. I don't see how the rate base gets any relief, or the rate payers get any relief from a rate base that's just valued higher than it was 4 years ago, 10 years ago. I think it's mostly focused on gasoline, and we talked about it a couple of months ago. Really, drill baby drill. There's a very low level of understanding about how the U.S. oil and gas industry works, and there's been no incentive to drill baby drill, just given the fact that there are a bunch of private actors who are placing investor priorities at the top of their list, and capital restraint and capital discipline and returns. That's not going to change unless there is some offsetting, and it has to be more than offsetting incentive to, continue to increase domestic production from here.
Yeah.
And it's, as you know, it's a global and complex set of markets between crude and refined product, for example. And if some of these restrictive measures that were highlighted in the Bloomberg piece come into place, the unintended consequence in some cases is prices go up, not down.
Yeah. No, and I think you're absolutely right on that, and I want to make sure we make this point: is drill baby drill is not going to lead to we can talk all we want to about how tough the government is. If you want to go drill a well today in Texas or Oklahoma, or for that matter, New Mexico, Montana, you can go get it drilled.
Right.
A little bit of a pain in the ass. Got to fill out some forms. Big whoop. I mean, we are not being burdened hugely by the government. Now, there are certain things that the government could do to make it better. Federal lands allow pipelines to be built here and there. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's investor driven.
I think, just to bring up the power side of it, I think one of the most ominous factors is this notion that, and ERCOT's fighting back pretty hard because it's already impacting, major utility areas like San Antonio, where you have the potential for EPA regs to come in and force thermal generation to be essentially net zero at the facility, which adds a lot of capital in terms of emissions capture and disposal. And so I think it was the ERCOT president that said, if these regs are put in place, you're basically going to make 12 gigawatts of coal-fired generation in ERCOT uneconomic. So you lose, true base load. So what steps in to replace that? From a reliability tier standpoint, that's got to be gas-fired generation. But if you're foisting those costs on combined cycle plants, for example, then again, I don't see how power prices go down with that type of really changing the playbook.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I'm advising the Trump Vance side of it, I'm not saying drill baby drill and prices will be cheap. My whole point is we're going to put the regulatory environment in place so that the energy infrastructure can be built so that we can achieve the future you want in terms of AI embedded in everything, digital access to this and that. If we don't, and then I'd wrap it in national security too, the ability for us to deal with less, need for foreign oil, et cetera. Particularly when it comes, same thing with critical minerals too. I'd be, hey, we're going to mine stuff here so that we can all have our iPhones that we want without using slave labor, et cetera. I'd be wrapping it in that. And so where I would be making the case that it's going to be cheaper is with availability. Ultimately, the end products will be cheaper, because if we don't have availability, it's going to go someplace else, and that gets into national security type issues. I think that's the case that the Republicans could honestly make.
So basically making the case that we can produce all the inputs to tech cheaper than sourcing it from places that have much more lax standards in terms of both climate and human rights.
The cost, if you will, is human rights, potentially strife with other countries in terms of embargoes. It's that, as opposed to, I'm going to tell the folks out in the Permian Basin to drill for more oil, and that's going to make gasoline prices go down. I mean, now that may be too large and too nuanced a story to tell, but I think that's the story that needs to be told, because if we're not going to build pipelines, build electric grid lines, et cetera, we're going to either outsource all that AI stuff
or we're not going to have it.
So
got a nice little unexplained outage last night for about 3 hours late at night.
Did you ever get an email on what happened?
No, never even got a response to my tweet.
Huh. But your grid's usually better than my grid.
I did see in the Entergy Texas Twitter profile that it's only monitored during business hours, and I guess 9:43 p.m. is not regular business hours.
Probably not.
I thought utilities were 24/7, 365.
Probably not.
Silly me.
Okay.
Let me. I think one of the most interesting dynamics that has unfolded here over the last few months is some of the most influential, particularly in the tech world, really definitively picking sides or doing things that show that, maybe cynically, that they're hedging their bets.
Right.
For example, the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, not endorsing a presidential candidate, which has caused a bit of mainstream media firestorm. But if you think about the alignment here, and we talked about it in the context of increasing momentum on the nuclear side, is there a force that kind of moves this stuff more constructively, in that I think the hedge that they're thinking of is primarily related to those that have been vocal supporters. Trump is the anticipation that there's going to be a fairly immediate regulatory cost burden, timeline burden impact in their favor. And so, I don't know if it's more than that, if there's some political handicapping that, makes it a slam dunk. I just find it interesting that at this point in time, a couple of weeks before the election, we've got old political affiliation or alignment behaviors being broken pretty prominently by some pretty big names.
Yeah. No, the thing I found interesting about the whole Bezos thing is just the ultimate lack of self-reflection. I mean, you have not heard one intellectually honest Democrat come out and say, maybe we just nominated someone that's not any better than the evil Donald Trump. I mean, there's been no reflection on this. It's been on par with spoiled children. Hey, man. Hey, Frack's here. We don't know where Kirk is still, but we got Colin.
Grab a chair. Talking about your favorite thing.
Yeah, we're talking politics. So I'm sorry. I know you're sorry you're missing. Yeah, exactly. So, no, but this feels like a spoiled child sitting there saying, I deserve $50 to $100 million a year, because that's what Bezos is having to pay to run a money-losing operation, so that I can go call half the country a bunch of Nazis.
Well,
I mean, and so I get the whole point of there's a conspiracy, they're sucking up to Trump and all, but you would think one person would just say, you know what? We're trying to run a business here, and we're taking half our customer base and throwing bombs at them.
I think
maybe we should be more responsible.
I like to think maybe there's a bit of an altruistic motive as well. I've always believed editorial boards are fine. I think with respect to political opinions, anyone who's credible in journalism and is writing an opinion piece is writing from their own personal or individual perspective. I think this move away from presidential endorsements by editorial boards really separates the institution and ultimately should create more trust, because they get back to their, again, very naive and probably completely ignored in this whole calculus of not endorsing. But the institutions that, 50 years ago, 25 years ago, were relied upon as purveyors of the truth and the facts. And so the politicization is just arguably leaned pretty hard one way over the last 25 years. But if we can kind of roll that back and maybe reverse course to where you separate the institution, they gain their credibility back, and they start practicing more traditional fact-based journalism. Yeah, opinion sections are fine, but there's a technology aspect, a disruption, obviously, that makes newspapers really bad businesses today. But I do think that, the distortion of what the platforms and the institutions have been about historically, what their legacy is based on, trying to get that back and regaining trust that has to be part of it.
And in fairness, what happened is, when you look at the distribution pipelines, you used to have one paper per city. You had, in effect, 3 major networks that broadcast stuff. And so advertising dollars that supported your business were based on viewership, popularity, your ratings, right?
Yeah, weren't you a Nielsen family?
I was a Nielsen family when we were young. I also realized very quickly not to write down what I was watching on HBO because my mom saw it. So, but no, and so it was based on popularity. So there was at least some market forces to play it down the middle and be fair and be a straight arrow. And then when we move to a world where literally, I mean, us two bozos can go on the air and have an audience, advertising dollars became less about popularity numbers and more about intensity. And so,
well, you can't watch a mainstream popular news show, whether it's MSNBC or Fox, without every break being just dominated by pharmaceutical ads.
Yeah. Us and New Zealand are the only two countries on the planet that allow pharmaceutical ads. And I've heard anywhere from 50 to 75% of money spent in advertising is pharmaceutical dollars. And I doubted that till one night. I was kind of watching it, and it's true. You start counting the ads, it's a lot of pills.
So the kind of the substantive energy issues or the energy policy dimension of preparing to vote, I think, is one of the most important things. And the fact that you raised this Bloomberg piece talking about what, really the special interests and the lobbyist groups on the progressive side are getting prepared to do, and some of the, seemingly extreme measures that I don't know what the split is between legislative and executive action, but I got to believe as much executive action as can be taken will be taken. If all this that's alluded to going on behind the scenes is true, think through that, because as I enumerated earlier, we've already seen very early examples of platitudes and ideals running up against reality of implementation, both from a feasibility standpoint, but also from a cost standpoint.
Yeah.
No. And I would like to think that most people, when they get in the booth, they vote their true self-interest. I know I do. And, that's not to say, and we've been talking a lot about what might happen if Vice President Harris wins the election. I do think that you had a 3-hour window of time to have a conversation with Joe Rogan. The policy explorations stay at a very, very high and superficial level.
Right.
Like January of 26, your energy costs will be cut in half. Okay, well, give me the basics of how that works.
Yeah, no, I think fair criticism of Rogan for that 3 hours, because I watched it too, was he probably didn't push and probe enough. But that's what Rogan does with everyone. And in fairness, I think I learned more about Trump just letting him free flow, than I necessarily do in sound bites of people yelling.
There wasn't necessarily a lot new there that you haven't heard if you've been paying attention to Trump for the past 8-9 years.
Although I will say the Lincoln bedroom story was interesting, because I hadn't heard him say that, and so being in awe of Lincoln and understanding what Lincoln was going through, and it was duly pointed out that he said the wrong child's name. It was Willie that wound up dying while the Lincolns were in office, not Tad. But I thought that was new. I thought his dissertation on tariffs from the 1880s and 1890s might ultimately be misguided, but at least it showed there's some historical basis for what he's thinking through. It's not just knee jerk.
Yeah, and there were a few kind of hyperbolic illustrations, like the giant Chinese car manufacturing plant that he thwarted in Mexico that was basically going to put Detroit out of business, and we'll have 200% tariffs on anything. And to the extent that there's an incentive to avoid that by foreign manufacturers, well, cite your facilities, like we've seen in the past, cite your facilities in the U.S. and employ U.S. labor. Right. I think that's the trade-off. But just in terms of the best ever, the most ever,
I mean, we've all bought a house. I mean, every time you buy a house, your real estate broker's like, oh, these are the greatest schools. This is the greatest shopping right here. This is the best street. You know, I mean,
there are very consumable, easy to translate basic facts about whatever policy issue, particularly as it relates to energy, that I think would go a long way in connecting with, okay, I get it. This has got, a pretty good probability of actually being workable. And I don't know that the failure to deliver over a 4-year term based on some grand promise is ever, really that big of a deal. But this is, particularly as it relates to energy and energy policy, it's pretty important stuff that we get right, because we're already on a bullet train to continue to push a transition model that has, run into some pretty
riddle me
significant points of friction.
Because I got 3 last things I want to talk about just real quick. One, the EV mandates, do they wind up mattering in Michigan? Do you have an opinion there?
I just think it's going to be over time. There's going to be a recognition of primarily the complexity and the timeline of the infrastructure. And they can't foist that burden on, lower and middle class people who by and large can't afford an acceptable alternative, although they're getting cheaper given what's going on in the EV market right now.
Right.
Can't afford all the, changes that need to be made to switch from that vehicle. And if Ford lost through the first 9 months of this year, and Ford's pretty important to Michigan, and Michigan's pretty important to Ford, in Ford Blue, which is the ICE division of their business, they made $3.7 billion. And in the EV division through the first 9 months of this year, they lost the same amount.
Yeah.
And, I've said it before, and we used to say it about a lot of things, everybody can hold their breath underwater for a minute. Let's see who can do it for 10.
Right.
And I think that is a kind of a microcosm, not only because it so directly impacts the profitability over a multi-year period of major corporate presence and automotive presence in Michigan, but it certainly affects the labor force, union negotiations, et cetera. So, Ford's already told you, and other manufacturers have already told you, we're going to defer a lot of these hurry up plans we had in the, in the euphoria of all the IRA related incentives to go out and do this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
I think the market will decide, do I think those things ultimately go away? It may not go away, but they're going to push out a number of years, and there's going to be all kinds of exceptions to them.
And I don't know that it's ultimately going to swing one way or another, but I do think there was a growing realization when you heard union workers talk about the presidential race and who they were voting for. And historically, unions have been very democratic, and just the recognition of Trump and the mandates and stuff. So it was more of an issue than I think it got credit for nationwide. But again, I'm not down in Michigan. Second thing I wanted to bounce off you. How worried are we about this? And I'm just going to start reading a list of things, and then I'll summarize it. Ballot boxes have been set on fire in Oregon and Washington. Lancaster County in Pennsylvania came out and said there were 2,500 suspicious voter registration applications. You had a ballot box fire in Phoenix, Arizona. Homeland Security has said there have been numerous ballot box destructions. You've got the federal government suing the state of Virginia over whether they can remove people that have self-designated themselves as non-citizens off the voter roll. You actually have a lawsuit going on right now in Detroit where they didn't keep ballot box surveillance film. They just destroyed it. Stuff. How worried are we about all these things? and I'll even go first just because I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know that any of this stuff is big enough to actually matter and sway the election one way or the other. Just it's shit we don't have to have, and it just leads to either side having, a claims of a fraudulent election. Why can't we just put rules in place? Paper ballots.
Yeah, we had
same day
rules
voting
in place.
hand counts.
I voted absentee one time. I was overseas. It was in the 92 election.
Yeah.
And, it was a fairly involved process. I was thinking about this morning, it is one of the most fundamental rights that American citizens enjoy. Should it be as easy as, just going to your Amazon app on a whim on an impulse buy? Should it be that convenient to exercise the right to vote? Now, obvious exceptions are those who don't have access, those who have physical limitations, those who, are in a situation over a long term to have to be able to vote via other channels, whether it's absentee. I think the notion of drop boxes out in the middle of the public that are not obviously all that secure in the cases that you went through, I think those are problematic. But, COVID really opened the bottle and the genie got out, and it's going to be really hard to put back. Unless there is a national referendum, do we have enough support for a constitutional amendment? Probably not. To make the voting process, I've heard great ideas. It ought to be a national holiday. You vote in person if you can. Again, those exceptions for those who are disadvantaged or don't have access should be made. But the consistency of the process and security of the process ought to be guaranteed by having a sound process. And it's something that is turned into, maybe too strong of a term, a bit of a free-for-all.
Yeah.
And the stakes are too high. I mean, you mentioned it. It's not just one side. I mean, there are shenanigans.
Yeah.
Actors on both sides.
That was not implied to mean either side, because quite frankly, the Lancaster County stuff may be, when we ultimately dig into it, it may be trying to register Amish folks, and that potentially is done by the Republicans. So
I'm really busy right now, but I said to myself, it would have been convenient to just go down the street and vote early. And I said, no, I'm going to go back to voting on election day. And if I have to wait in line for 2 hours, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Not
that my vote is going to swing Montgomery County, but
right. Yeah. The issue I have is I am loath to change the Constitution. I mean, the fact we've had the limited number of amendments that we have, I think, is a relatively good thing. I mean, you look at certain states where anything, the Constitution gets
Texas
changed.
has, I think, been amended 516 times since its inception on something a little bit over 700 proposals.
Yeah. And we're even one of the better ones. I mean, there are some states, I think, with even more than that. So I'm loath to do that. And the Constitution is specific that the state legislatures determine the voting procedures and all. But, I still cannot fathom a reason for not having to show an ID.
That was, Rogan's talked about that quite a bit, and he described it as his steel man, and he's examined it and tried to come up with an alternative to the argument as to why you would be opposed to voter ID other than, well, you want to cheat. And there's just no...
Now, the one thing...
There's nothing within kind of rational boundary of analysis that would suggest otherwise. Because
I did read
functioning in this country...
Yeah.
In any transaction or any access to planes, to transacting with your bank to getting pulled over,
right,
or buying insurance.
Well, the one thing I did read a tweet, and I wish I had saved it because I want to credit the guy. The guy said, "Look," he said, "it's not." He goes, "I agree. We should have to show an ID. The problem is if you make that the law, then you start looking at groups you want to disadvantage, i.e., let's target minorities. You go to the minority area and you get rid of the DMV in that area so that they don't have easy access to get one. Then it leads to all the problems in America. I can't fly. I can't do all that." And that to me is at least a somewhat reasonable, albeit far-fetched reason. Because, I mean, certain groups have been disadvantaged in history, and you went after neighborhoods and you figured out how to put an economic chokehold and strangle on them. And so, okay, maybe that is the case. But at the end of the day, I still just, I think if you're against voter ID, you just want to cheat.
Yeah, I mean, forever we've had allegedly full access to voters or citizens when you need to contact somebody through the Social Security Administration or the IRS. You know, can there be multiple centralized capabilities that would allow a uniform, I don't know, is it a separate national voter ID based upon, whatever means you have, you make access and completion to successfully securing a national voter ID, you level that playing field because it's got to be equal.
Yeah,
at the end of the day, for
the government can't charge you
voting
tax
eligibles
unless you have a voter ID
Right.
card.
And
Civil libertarian in me is worried about centralizing that database, but practically speaking, they already have it.
Of course.
I mean, numerous government officials say we got a list of who's a citizen and who's not. So anyway, well, it will be interesting. Are you going to give us a prediction? We should put it on the record. I mean, it doesn't mean you're rooting for it. Just what is your prediction?
I'm not going to predict the outcome. I do think it comes out to what happens in Pennsylvania from an electoral vote standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, I think Nate Silver says whoever wins Pennsylvania has a 95% chance of winning the election.
I haven't looked at the state level betting market statistics, but you look nationally and the Trump lead keeps growing.
Right.
But we have to remember that it's going to come down to a swing state or two, more than likely. That's my prediction. Trying to correlate with rally sizes and media appearances and
comedians' jokes,
polls, et cetera, and comedians' jokes. It's just devolved so much into the kind of ugly and.
Well, what it comes down to is if Trump in 16 and 2020 underpolled by about 3 to 4% both times. And so, the reason for that is you're either embarrassed to admit that you're voting for Trump or somebody calls you and you're like, screw you, right? And so if he's underpolling by 3 to 4%, Trump wins. The guy that did the polling in the Romney-Obama race, everybody had that as a 50-50 toss-up, and Obama won by 3%. The same guy that was the only one that really made that call and said, no, Obama's got this by about 3%. The same guy has come out and said, it's a toss-up race. It truly is a 50-50. And so the early indications seem to be that Republicans are voting early now, more so than they ever have. But ultimately, are these new voters that are energized to go out and vote for the Republicans, or is this just stealing people that used to vote on election day?
I saw a Democrat rebuttal to that where they showed early voting breakout where there was a surprising surge in the proportion of Republicans. I think it was in Nevada. And the rebuttal was, well, look at the registrations in this state. Well, registrations don't necessarily translate to you actually going through
Right.
the process of voting. So I think if it's within 1% or 2% nationally from just the collection of polls that I think are reasonably good, then I think you're right. I think, I think that creates a path for Trump to win the electoral count. So,
but frankly, the interesting thing is going to be the House. I mean, I think the Republicans take the Senate because they win West Virginia, they win Montana. So they assuming Cruz holds on in Texas, and I can't get a read on whether that race is really close or Ted's just, chicken little to raise more money. But assuming, so it looks like the Republicans will have the Senate. It's just a question of how big. Do they get to 55 or are they hanging out at 51? The House is going to be interesting, because there were definitely some seats picked up last time, like in New York, the 5 congressional members in New York, that because Lee What's-His-Face ran such a good race for governor, he had some coattails that maybe those coattails don't exist.
And the equity markets love gridlock. So if it's if there's no clear mandate, legislative mandate, I think that's from a self-interested standpoint ultimately a good thing. But go vote.
Go vote.
If you haven't,
get your popcorn. It's gonna be a heck of a show. You didn't ask me about my pen.
I was staring at it, and eyes are up here.
All right.
Look like a guitar pick. What is your pen?
It is a poppy. It is a poppy because in Great Britain, they celebrate Armistice Day, November 11th. And it is the celebration of the end of World War I, kind of almost our Memorial Day.
So there's a lead up period to wear the poppy up to the 11th. Because I've been in London on Armistice Day, which is cool because everybody's got a poppy on, and I knew all that history. Major League Baseball, in fact, on Memorial Day, has gone from full custom kit, uniform, camo, armed forces to now they just have a poppy on their jerseys, and that was Memorial Day is one manifestation of Remembrance Day,
right?
Which is where the poppy originated.
So so I will be wearing it up till wearing it proudly up till the 11th. Laura just got back from London, and she brought us all poppies.
She didn't bring 2.
I will get a poppy for you.
I think I have one somewhere in a drawer that I'm emptying out as I pack to move.
As you move, so
yeah. Well, we hopefully we'll have some clarity. By the time
maybe we do
next week's show rolls
next
around.
Wednesday, and hopefully we can talk about it. Hopefully we're not in a bunker somewhere.
One thing I would, there's one dynamic here that if Trump wins, he's done after his term, obviously. And, how does that factor into, some of the things legislatively that do or do not get done?
Which I think is the anti-Trumpers' best argument was, hey, because at the end of the day, you sit there, anytime you hear something anti-Trump, you go, well, did it happen last time? No. But I do think the argument back is he's not gonna be running for re-election, so he'll be unfettered, and he won't have the same type of people around him he had last time to check and hold him in line. I do think that's probably their best line of argument on things. So it will be interesting to watch. If you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to a friend. We'll be back next week. Hopefully we'll have a president we can talk about, but we'll see.